The calm before the storm has a certain weight to it, the way it presses against the horizon and makes even the birds fall quiet. On that day, the sky over Earl Mitchell's farm in Iowa carried a tension that felt almost alive. The air was thick with humidity and expectation, and somewhere beyond the line of trees that marked the edge of his property, a storm was gathering strength. This is not a story about weather alone. It is about what happens when the forces of nature collide with the spirit of a man who has spent his life working the land. When the wind takes what your hands built, what is left? If you have ever looked at the sky and felt that familiar mix of awe and dread, if you have ever watched the clouds roll in and known that something is about to change forever, then this story will speak to you. Earl had spent that morning doing what he had always done. He checked the fences, walked the fields, and listened to the wind whisper through the corn. The barn stood solid and proud, a structure his father had built 50 years earlier, with boards cut from trees they had harvested together. It was more than a building. It was a testament to sweat, sacrifice, and the continuity of a family. Inside its walls were memories layered as thick as the dust that settled on the rafters. Earl could run his hand along a beam and feel not just the grain of the wood, but the presence of the father who had swung the hammer beside him when he was still a boy. As he worked, there was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind that he could not shake. The weather report on the radio had warned of severe storms. The local meteorologist had used phrases like rotating thunderstorm and potential tornado. Those were words that farmers in the heartland learned to respect. Earl had always paid attention to the sky. It was a habit formed from decades of living at the mercy of rainfall, sunlight, and wind. He had looked up during droughts and prayed for rain. He had looked up during harvest and asked for clear skies. On that day, he looked up and felt an unease that went beyond the usual anxiety of a weather forecast. There is something in the human heart that recognizes when the world is about to shift. You do not need scientific instruments to feel it. The animals sense it first. The horses become restless. The barn cats disappear into hidden corners. The wind changes direction and temperature. Earl could feel it in his bones, the same way he could tell when the first frost was coming or when a calf was about to be born. This intuition had guided him through decades of farming. It was the difference between preparing in time and being caught off guard. As he walked from the pasture to the house, he thought about his father, about how many storms they had endured together. He remembered a summer when he was 12, and they had sat on the porch during a thunderstorm so fierce that it shook the glasses in the cupboard. His father had not been afraid. He had told Earl that storms were a part of life on the plains. They would come and go, and what mattered was how you faced them. You could hide and hope, or you could stand and fight for what you loved. Those words had carved themselves into Earl's character like initials in fresh concrete. They were the foundation he stood on when the clouds began to darken. By midday, the first low rumbles of thunder rolled across the fields. Earl took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of rain and ozone. He had already moved the cattle to lower ground and secured the loose equipment. He double-checked that the doors to the barn were closed tight. He fed the horses earlier than usual so they would be calm. There was a checklist in his mind, a ritual born of experience. A barn is more than wood and nails. It is a sanctuary for animals, a repository for the tools of survival, a place where families gather to work and to celebrate. Protecting it meant protecting not just the structure, but everything it represented. He paused for a moment at the threshold of the barn and looked inside. The sunlight filtered through the cracks in the siding, casting long stripes across the floor. The hayloft was full, the bales stacked high against the far wall. The tractor, old but reliable, sat in its usual spot with the keys hanging on a nail above it. Earl could see the scar on one of the beams where he had accidentally driven the tractor into it 20 years earlier. He smiled at the memory. The barn was a living record of mistakes and triumphs, each mark a story of perseverance. Outside, the wind picked up. It came in sharp gusts at first, then a constant howl that made the metal of the barn roof vibrate. The sky turned a sickly green, a color that farmers associate with the worst kind of storms. Earl felt the first drops of rain hit his skin, large and heavy like pebbles. He pulled his hat lower over his eyes and tightened his coat. He knew there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. Nature had its own agenda, its own rhythm that no man could control. He could only prepare, endure, and hope that when it passed, he would still be standing. As the rain began to fall in earnest, he thought about the people who would watch this story later. He imagined faces in cities and small towns alike, people who might never have walked a field but who understood what it meant to fight for something that mattered. If you are one of those people, if you have ever felt the weight of responsibility for something bigger than yourself, then you will understand why Earl did not leave his farm when the first flashes of lightning split the sky. He stayed because his entire life was rooted in that soil. He stayed because leaving would have been more painful than any storm. He stayed because he believed in the dignity of standing your ground. There are moments in life that define us. They are not always chosen. They often come when the choice is between easy comfort and hard truth. Earl Mitchell's storm began in a sky that gave no mercy, but what it revealed about him had been forged long before the first raindrop fell. Stay with this story as the wind rises and the sky darkens. The storm is coming, and with it, a test of faith, family, and the unbreakable spirit of a man who refuses to be broken. When the barn falls, what remains will tell you everything you need to know about what matters. To understand the weight of the barn and its loss, you need to know the man who built his life around it. Earl Mitchell was born on a cold January morning in 1958 in the same farmhouse where he would later raise his own children. His parents were not wealthy by any measure other than the richness of their land and the strength of their work ethic. They had come from families of farmers, each generation passing down not just the property, but the values that defined it. For Earl, the barn was a symbol of those values. It represented sacrifice, community, and a promise that the land would be cared for. As a boy, Earl spent his summers running barefoot through freshly plowed fields, his heels coated in dark Iowa soil. He learned to drive a tractor before he could reach the pedals without sitting on a stack of old feed sacks. He learned that work began before sunrise and often stretched until the stars were bright. He learned that nothing came easy, but everything worthwhile was worth sweating for. It was his father who taught him these lessons, not with lectures, but with example. Earl would watch him come in from the fields, hands calloused and face lined with sun, and think that there was no strength greater than his father's. The barn was built the year Earl turned 18. It was a milestone, both practical and symbolic. The old structure they had been using was too small and too worn. His father had saved for years to buy the materials. The neighbors came to help raise the walls, a tradition as old as the community itself. Earl remembers the day like it happened yesterday. The smell of fresh-cut lumber, the sound of hammers echoing across the fields, the camaraderie of men and women working together. It took them 2 days to raise the skeleton and another week to finish the siding and roof. By the time they were done, the barn stood like a promise fulfilled. In that barn, life unfolded season after season. Calves were born in the straw-lined stalls, their cries filling the space with new life. Hogs were fed, horses brushed, kittens chased mice along the rafters. The barn hosted 4th of July picnics when thunderstorms were too close for comfort. It served as a shelter during blizzards and as a stage for stories told by lantern light when the power went out. It was where Earl's mother had hung laundry on rainy days and where she had taught Earl and his siblings how to dance by moving their feet to the rhythm of country music playing on an old radio. That barn was not just wood and nails, it was the heart of a family. When Earl took over the farm after his father's death, the barn became his responsibility. He painted it every few years to keep the wood protected. He fixed the roof when hailstones punched holes in the tin. He replaced boards that rotted or warped. In those moments, he could feel his father's presence guiding his hands. Maintaining the barn felt like a conversation across time. It was a way of saying that he saw what his father built, and that he would keep it standing. In rural communities, there are few physical structures that carry as much emotional weight as a barn. It is a landmark, a symbol of stability. It tells anyone driving by that the people who live there care about what they have been given. Earl married a woman named Sarah when he was 24. She had grown up 3 towns over, the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher. She understood the demands of farm life and the way weather could dictate your plans. Together, they built a life anchored by the routine of livestock and crops, and the barn was a central part of that life. They raised 2 sons and a daughter. The children learned to walk on that barn floor. They climbed its ladder to the hayloft, even after Earl told them not to. They chased each other in and out of the wide sliding doors, their laughter mingling with the sound of animals. The barn watched them grow from toddlers into teenagers, and then into adults, who left for college or jobs in the city, but who always returned for holidays and harvest. Over the years, the barn witnessed the full spectrum of human experience. It held the grief of funeral preparations when Earl's mother passed away. It echoed with celebration when his daughter got engaged, and they threw a party with friends and neighbors. It absorbed the frustration of mechanical breakdowns, the tension of arguments about finances, the quiet moments when Earl or Sarah needed to sit alone and think. The barn was not a silent witness. It creaked and groaned. It resonated with music and prayer. It smelled of hay, animals, and old wood. Each of these sensory details is important because they ground this story in the tangible world of farming. When the storm took the barn, it was not just taking a building. It was striking at the center of a family's history. Earl's children grew up and moved away, as children often do. They took with them the lessons they had learned, that hard work matters, that integrity is non-negotiable, and that family is not defined by convenience. They called home during storms, asking their father how the farm was holding up, and he always assured them that everything was under control. In their minds, the barn was as permanent as the land itself. It was unimaginable that anything could happen to it. They had seen it stand through winds that snapped trees and hail that dented vehicles. They had watched snow pile on its roof during winters that seemed endless. The barn was timeless, but time is relentless, and so are the elements. Structures age, boards weather, nails rust. Even as Earl maintained the barn, he could not stop the slow creep of wear and tear. He replaced planks, but there was always another that needed work. He patched the roof, but there was always another seam to seal. He swept out corners, but dust always returned. The barn's endurance was as much about Earl's dedication as it was about the materials. He knew this, even if he did not say it out loud. That knowledge lingered in the back of his mind as the clouds darkened on the day the storm arrived. As you think about Earl's life and the barn that defined it, consider your own anchors. What structures hold your memories? What spaces have absorbed your laughter, your tears, your moments of triumph and defeat? For some, it may be a home, a church, a school. For others, it may be a garden, a kitchen table, a favorite park bench. The physical places we occupy become repositories for our stories. They matter because they remind us where we have been and what we have survived. Earl's barn was that place for him. When it fell, it was not just a physical loss, but a challenge to his identity. If you have a place like that in your life, take a moment to acknowledge it. Think about the walls that have witnessed your growth, the floors that have supported your steps, the ceilings that have sheltered your dreams. Maybe you have lost a place, like that to fire, flood, or time. Maybe you have not. Either way, you understand the fear that grips the heart when you see something precious threatened. That understanding is what connects us across distances and experiences. It is what allows someone in a city apartment to empathize with a farmer in Iowa facing a wall of dark clouds. It is the shared recognition that our lives are rooted in more than our bodies. They are rooted in places that hold us even when the winds howl. The storm that would test Earl's resolve did not care about his memories or his maintenance. It was a product of atmospheric conditions that could not be bargained with. That morning had been hot and humid, the kind of day that made sweat bead on your forehead even before you started work. Far to the west, a cold front had been moving in, colliding with the warm, moist air hanging over the Midwest. When those fronts meet, energy is released in ways that can be both beautiful and terrifying. Thunderheads build, winds shear, and sometimes rotation forms. Meteorologists can track these things with radars and satellites, but on the ground, farmers read the sky with instinct and experience. Earl listened to the noon weather update. The radio crackled with static as the announcer described a line of storms moving east at a pace that would bring them to his county by late afternoon. They mentioned the possibility of strong, straight-line winds and large hail. There was a tone in the announcer's voice that suggested more than the usual caution. Earl went over his list again. He moved the pickup truck under a lean-to, covered the smaller equipment, and made sure the generator was ready in case the power went out. He wondered if he should bring the animals into the barn or leave them in the pasture. Bringing them inside could protect them from hail, but also put them at risk if the barn was damaged. He decided to leave them out, trusting that they would instinctively seek shelter in the low areas and among the trees if things turned bad. Sarah had passed away 3 years earlier. Her absence was a hole that no amount of work could fill. Earl felt it more acutely during storms because she had always been the calm voice reminding him that they could get through anything together. Without her, the house was quieter, the barn emptier. Their children called more often after her death. Aware that their father was alone, but calls are not the same as a presence. Still, Earl felt her with him that day. He could almost hear her telling him to check the windows again and to make sure the lanterns had fresh batteries. He could feel her hand on his shoulder as the wind began to pick up. The first gusts were playful, like a dog testing the strength of a leash. They rustled the leaves in the maple trees and made the tall grass dance in waves. The clouds moved faster, and the light filtered through them in strange patterns. Earl looked to the west and saw a wall cloud forming, a lowering mass that indicated serious rotation. He had seen wall clouds before, but this one was particularly ominous. He walked out to the middle of his yard to get a better view and felt the wind wrap around him, warm at first, and then suddenly cool. That temperature drop was the front arriving. Earl's heart beat faster. There was no more time to prepare. In the distance, he heard the wail of the county siren. It was a long, mournful sound that cut through the increasing roar of the wind. The siren meant that a tornado warning had been issued. Earl's nearest neighbors were a quarter-mile down the road. He hoped they were already in their cellar. He thought briefly about going to his own storm cellar, but something held him back. It was not stubbornness or bravado. It was the knowledge that if he was not there to see what happened, he would never forgive himself. The barn had been his father's dream and his life's work. To abandon it felt impossible. He needed to see it through, for better or worse. The rain started abruptly. It was heavy and slanted, driven by wind that now howled like a freight train. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the trees bending under the force. The world turned white and green in flashes. Earl could feel the static in the air make the hairs on his arms stand up. He retreated to the house long enough to grab a heavy coat and a flashlight. When he stepped back outside, he could barely stay on his feet. The wind had picked up pieces of debris and whipped them across the yard. Leaves, branches, and bits of paper flew past in a chaotic dance. He made his way to the barn, leaning into the wind, fighting for each step. The animals in the pasture were grouped tightly, their instincts telling them to huddle together. Earl considered trying to herd them toward the lower ground, but decided against it. There was not enough time, and the wind was too strong. Instead, he focused on the barn. He reached the doors and pulled them open just enough to slip inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the noise changed. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, it was a deep groaning sound as the structure flexed. He climbed the stairs to the hayloft for a better view of the approaching storm. From the open window near the peak, he saw a sight that filled him with awe and fear. A funnel cloud was descending from the wall of clouds, its base swirling as it reached toward the ground. It was not yet fully formed, but he knew if it touched down, there would be no stopping it. Tornadoes do not negotiate. They do not change course because you ask nicely. They take what they will and leave nothing but ruin in their wake. Standing there, watching the funnel form, Earl thought about leaving. He thought about running to the cellar and closing the heavy door and waiting for the chaos to pass. But his feet did not move. He thought about the countless nights he had slept in the hayloft as a boy when the house was too hot. He thought about the afternoons he had spent leaning against these very beams after long hours in the sun. He thought about his father teaching him how to drive nails straight, and his mother calling them in for dinner with a voice that could be heard across the fields. He thought about Sarah standing in the doorway, a new baby in her arms. These images were not nostalgia. They were reasons. They were stakes. They were anchors that held him in place when logic said he should run. If you have ever faced a moment where every rational instinct told you to turn away, but some deeper part of you compelled you to stand your ground, then you know what anchored Earl to that barn. The decisions we make in the face of danger often reveal what we value most. Earl valued his history, his family, his promises. He was not going to abandon the symbol of those things without a fight. As the funnel cloud touched the ground and transformed into a tornado, he took a deep breath and braced himself. This was not bravado. It was the quiet determination of someone who knows that sometimes the only thing you can do is plant your feet and trust that the roots you have grown over a lifetime will hold. The tornado touched down in a field about a mile away. Earl watched it tear through a stand of trees like they were twigs. It moved unpredictably, not in a straight line, but in a series of sudden, violent motions. It lifted briefly, then slammed back to the ground. It chewed up dirt and debris, tossing it high into the air. He could hear the roar, an almost animal sound that filled the air even over the wind. He whispered a prayer without forming words. The tornado seemed to pause, as if deciding its next move, and then turned toward his farm. This was the moment when time slowed. It was the moment when every second felt stretched thin and every sound was amplified. Earl's heart pounded in his chest. He tightened his grip on the railing of the loft and watched as the tornado moved closer. It swallowed fence posts, ripped shingles from the farmhouse roof, and tossed a piece of corrugated metal through the air like a blade. The noise was deafening. The barn shuddered as the wind pressed against its side. Earl felt the floor vibrate under his feet. What happened next was a combination of physics and fate. The tornado, swirling at hundreds of miles per hour, struck the barn at an angle that peeled the roof up as easily as a child lifts the lid of a toy box. Boards snapped, nails ripped free, and the sound of tearing wood filled the space. Earl instinctively dropped to the floor, covering his head with his arms. Dust and debris rained down on him. He could feel the barn moving, shifting. There was a moment of weightlessness, as if the very laws of gravity had been suspended, and then the world crashed down. For a brief second, it was as if time itself held its breath. Earl lay on the floorboards of the hayloft, eyes squeezed shut against the dust and splinters, ears filled with the roar of wind and the groans of wood under stress. He could not tell if the barn was collapsing or if it was simply being torn apart piece by piece. The noise was overwhelming. It was the sound of history being ripped away. It was the sound of something sacred being tested beyond its limits. in that cacophony, there was a shocking clarity, the realization that nature owed him nothing, and that all of his years of care and maintenance might not be enough to save the structure he loved. He opened his eyes to chaos. The roof was gone, torn off as if it had never been attached. Rain poured into the loft through the gap, soaking the hay and turning dust to mud. Earl could see the swirling funnel outside, a monstrous column of wind and debris framed by the jagged edges of the roofline. The walls of the barn were still standing, but they were moving, flexing, and twisting under forces they were never meant to withstand. Each groan of the timbers was like a warning that something was going to give. In those moments, there was no time to think about the bigger picture. There was only the immediate need to survive. Earl crawled toward the stairs, staying low to avoid being blown over by the wind. The barn shook violently. He slid down the stairs more than walked, his boots slipping on the wet wood. When he reached the ground floor, he looked up and saw daylight where darkness should have been. The tornado had peeled back sections of the wall, leaving gaping openings where boards had been. The horses, in their stalls, were whinnying and kicking, sensing the danger but trapped by the heavy doors. Earl made a split-second decision. He moved to the first stall and threw open the gate. The horse bolted out, eyes wide with terror, nostrils flared. It ran through the open doorway and into the storm. He did the same with the next stall and the next, releasing each animal as quickly as he could. The animals scattered, some running toward the pasture, others seeking shelter in the trees. In a calmer moment, he might have worried about their safety, but right then his focus was on giving them a chance. A barn can be rebuilt. A life cannot. Once the animals were out, he turned his attention to the equipment. The tractor was too large to move quickly, and there was no time to drive it out. He grabbed the keys off the nail and tossed them into his pocket, a reflex born of years of not losing things. He knew that if the barn collapsed, the tractor might be damaged beyond repair. It was a risk he had to accept. He looked around one last time, taking in the tools, the bales of hay, the empty stalls. He felt a deep sadness settle in his chest. He understood that this might be the last time he saw this place as he had always known it. Outside, the tornado moved across the yard, its funnel still wide and hungry. Earl felt the pressure change as it passed, his ears popping, his body feeling both heavy and light at the same time. He stumbled as a gust of wind hit him sideways, nearly knocking him off his feet. He grabbed onto the frame of the barn door to steady himself. At that moment, the tornado hit the barn fully. The sound was beyond description, a mix of tearing, crashing, and roaring that shook Earl to his core. The walls seemed to implode inward and then explode outward in the same breath. Boards were ripped from their nails and flung through the air. The loft floor twisted. The entire structure groaned one final time as if sighing, and then it collapsed. Earl was thrown backward by the force of it. He landed in the mud and scrambled to his feet, disoriented but unhurt. He watched as the barn that had stood for 50 years crumpled into a heap of splintered wood and twisted metal. It happened in seconds. The tornado, satisfied with its destruction, continued on its path, tearing through more trees and then lifting back into the sky as quickly as it had descended. The wind died down. The rain eased. The roar was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of shifting debris and the distant cry of an animal. In that silence, Earl stood alone in his yard, surrounded by pieces of his past scattered across the field. The barn was gone. All that remained was a pile of lumber, a cloud of dust settling in the rain, and the shock that follows an encounter with something much larger than yourself. He felt numb. The loss was so sudden and total that it did not feel real. He had been inside those walls minutes before. Now they lay in ruins at his feet. He could not wrap his mind around it. He took a step forward and then another, drawn toward the wreckage as if to confirm that it was really gone. He picked up a piece of wood and recognized it as part of the beam he had helped his father raise all those years ago. The board was splintered at one end. The other still held a bent nail. He ran his hand along it, feeling the familiar texture of the grain. Tears welled up in his eyes, mixing with the rain on his cheeks. He did not cry often. Farming teaches you to endure, to hold steady through drought, hail, and loss. But this was different. This was the erasure of a piece of his identity. The barn was not alive, but it had been a living part of his life, and now it lay broken and still. As he stood there, he became aware of his own body. He felt the ache in his legs from running, the burn in his lungs from breathing dust, the sting on his skin where debris had struck him. He realized how close he had come to being caught inside when it collapsed. A few seconds either way, and he might have been trapped under the rubble. The thought sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. He was grateful to be alive, to have come through the storm with his life intact. The barn was gone, but he was not. The storm had taken wood and metal, but it had not taken the man. That realization did not lessen the grief, but it did add a layer of gratitude. If you have ever experienced a sudden loss, you know the disorienting feeling that follows. It is like standing in a familiar room that has been rearranged while you are gone. The walls are the same, but nothing else is. You reach for something that is no longer there and feel the phantom of its absence. Earl felt that phantom as he stood where the barn had once been. He reached out instinctively to steady himself on a beam that was no longer upright and caught air. Loss is not just the absence of a thing. It is the absence of the routines, the muscle memory, the sensory experiences tied to that thing. It is the disruption of the expected. Around him, the farm bore the scars of the storm. A tree had been uprooted near the fence line. A small shed had lost its roof. The house had a few shingles missing, but it stood strong. The animals, miraculously, were alive and relatively uninjured. They gathered at the edges of the property, eyes wide, bodies trembling, but safe. Earl felt a surge of gratitude wash over him. He had saved the animals by releasing them when he did. They had survived because he had chosen to act. That choice, made in the chaos of the moment, had been the right one. In the minutes and hours that followed, he moved through the wreckage in a daze, picking up pieces, setting aside what could be salvaged, and simply sitting when the weight of it all became too heavy. He thought about calling his children, but decided to wait until he had the words to describe what had happened. How do you explain to someone that a piece of their childhood is gone? How do you prepare them for that loss? He decided that they needed to hear it from him directly, not through a voicemail or a hurried call. He would wait until he could speak without his voice breaking. As the adrenaline wore off and the storm clouds moved on, leaving behind a brilliant patch of blue sky as if nothing had happened, Earl felt the first stirrings of a new emotion. It was not acceptance, not yet. It was something like determination. The barn was gone, but he was still here. The farm was still here. The work was not done simply because a structure had fallen. The fields would need to be planted. The animals would need to be cared for. The seasons would continue their unrelenting march. He realized that he had a choice. He could let the barn's destruction break him, or he could let it become the foundation for something new. The first night after the storm was the hardest. The house felt too quiet without the hum of the barn ventilators and the soft noises of animals settling in for the evening. Earl sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring out the window at the pile of rubble. The moon rose and cast a pale light on the wreckage, making the splintered wood look almost white. He kept expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the barn against the night sky, but there was only emptiness. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of the house, made him flinch. Without the barn, the landscape felt unbalanced, like a face missing a nose. He slept fitfully, dreaming of storms and of his father's voice. In one dream, he and his father were standing in a field watching a tornado approach. and his father turned to him and said something he could not quite hear.
Looks good.
He woke up
Best
with those
fence in the
unheard
valley.
words echoing in his mind and an ache in his chest that was
Just
both
the way I
physical
like it.
and emotional.
Looks
Grief
strong.
is often described as a weight,
This one needs a
but it
tighter
is
wire,
also a
though.
vibration, a low hum that resonates in your
Perfect.
bones. It makes everyday tasks feel harder. It makes time drag. The next morning, he put on his boots and walked out to the wreckage. The air smelled of damp wood and earth. He began the work of sorting through the debris. He salvaged what he could: a few intact beams, some metal roofing that could be repurposed, tools that had survived the collapse. He moved slowly, feeling the weight of each piece of wood he lifted. Every board carried a memory. Every nail he pulled took him back to the day it had been driven in. He found the horseshoe Sarah had hung on the doorway for luck. It was bent, but not broken. He set it aside carefully. As he worked, his neighbors began to arrive. Word travels quickly in rural communities, especially when disaster strikes. One by one, pickup trucks pulled into the driveway. Familiar faces appeared, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. They did not come empty-handed. They brought tools, food, and manpower. They brought strong backs and an abundance of casseroles. They did not ask if Earl needed help. They simply started picking up pieces of wood and sorting them into piles. This is the way of the countryside. When someone is hit by a storm, neighbors show up with work gloves and casseroles. Among the first to arrive was Tom, a friend from down the road. He had known Earl his whole life. They had gone to school together and had helped each other through harvests and blizzards. Tom put a hand on Earl's shoulder and squeezed, a simple gesture that conveyed more than words. It said, "I'm here. You're not alone." Others soon joined. There was Nancy, who taught at the local school and had always shown up with meals when someone was sick. There was Roger, a retired mechanic who could fix anything with an engine. There were teenagers, children of neighbors, who had grown up riding their bikes down the gravel roads. There were older men who had helped raise the barn 50 years ago and now came to help tear it down. The work was dirty and hard, but there was laughter among the tears. They shared stories about the barn and about Earl's father. They remembered the dances that had been held there and the times they had taken shelter under its roof. They joked about the time someone had spilled a bucket of paint and it had stained the floorboards, leaving a white patch that no one had ever bothered to cover. These stories were a way of honoring what had been lost and of reminding Earl that the barn lived on in their memories even if it was gone from the land. Earl's children arrived later that day. They had driven through the night after hearing his voice on the phone. When they saw the wreckage, they stood silently for a moment, taking it in. His daughter, her eyes bright with unshed tears, hugged him tightly. His sons clapped him on the back, their jaws tight. They each spent a moment alone with the rubble, picking up a piece of wood and running their hands over it, connecting with their past. They helped with the cleanup, their presence a tangible reminder that the family bond remained strong despite the physical loss. Earl felt a mixture of sorrow and pride watching them work side by side, their faces set in the same determined lines that he saw in the mirror every morning. By the end of the day, the debris had been sorted into piles, salvaged materials, burned wood to be disposed of, and a heap of twisted metal that would go to scrap. The yard looked different, less chaotic, but also emptier. The open space where the barn had stood was shocking. Earl could see all the way to the back of his property without the building blocking his view. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The barn had always been a buffer, both physically and psychologically. Without it, the farm seemed to lie bare to the elements, to the gaze of anyone passing by. Earl felt the absence as a chill. That evening, the neighbors gathered around Earl's kitchen table. They brought dishes of food and filled the house with the smell of casseroles and fresh bread. They talked about rebuilding. Someone pulled out a notepad and started sketching possibilities. How big did the new barn need to be? What kind of materials should they use? Should they pour a concrete foundation this time? Should they add a lean-to for more equipment? The conversation was practical, focused on solutions. It was a balm for the rawness of the day. It shifted the focus from loss to possibility. Earl listened, thankful for the distraction and for the support. He felt overwhelmed by the logistics of rebuilding, but also encouraged by the energy around him. He knew that rebuilding would not erase the loss of the original barn. It would not replace the memories, but it would provide a new space for future memories. It would allow him to continue farming with dignity and safety. It would be a statement of resilience, a declaration that storms may take wood and nails, but they will not take the spirit of the farmer who built them. When the neighbors left and the house grew quiet again, Earl sat with his children and talked about Sarah, about their grandparents, about all the times they had taken shelter in the barn. They laughed through tears at some stories and fell silent during others. Grief is strange. It can make you cry and laugh in the same breath. It can make you feel heavy and light simultaneously. Sharing those memories was part of the healing. It reminded them that the barn had been a setting for their story, but it had not been the story itself. The story was them, their love, their work, their resilience. If you have ever been knocked down by something unexpected, a storm, a loss, a betrayal, and have been lifted by the hands of your community, you know the power of people showing up. Earl's neighbors did not fix everything. They did not make the barn reappear, but they carried some of the burden so that it did not break him. They reminded him that he was part of something larger than his own grief. They gave him a reason to believe that rebuilding was not only possible, but inevitable. As the night wore on, Earl thought about what the new barn would look like. He imagined the shape of the roof and the placement of the windows. He thought about where the stalls would go and what color he might paint it. These thoughts were hopeful. They were a way of focusing forward. But he also allowed himself to sit with the sadness, to honor the barn that had been. He walked out to the pile of salvaged wood and picked up a board he recognized from the feed room. He smelled it. It still held the scent of hay and animals. He held it until the memories it carried eased their grip on his heart. Rebuilding a barn is not an overnight task. It requires planning, resources, and time. It requires knowledge of modern building codes and respect for traditions. It requires patience and perseverance, two qualities that farmers have in abundance. For Earl, the decision to rebuild was both practical and symbolic. He needed a barn for the animals and equipment, but he also needed to reaffirm his commitment to the farm. Rebuilding would be his way of saying that his relationship with the land could survive even the worst storm. The first step was designing the new structure. Earl sat down with an architect who specialized in agricultural buildings. They discussed the purpose of each section. They talked about ventilation, insulation, and lighting. They considered where the stalls should be to maximize efficiency. Earl insisted on using some of the salvaged wood from the old barn. It was important to him that the new barn carried pieces of the old one, not just as a tribute, but as a physical link between past and future. The architect nodded in understanding, appreciating the sentiment behind the request. They decided on a barn that would be slightly larger than the original, with a sturdier foundation and reinforced walls to better withstand future storms. They incorporated a modern drainage system to prevent water from pooling around the base. They planned for a loft with an easier access ladder and better safety features. They added a small office space where Earl could keep records and store tools. The design balanced practicality with respect for tradition. It would be a working barn, not a museum, but it would honor the barn that had been lost. Once the plans were finalized, the real work began. Earl and his neighbors spent days clearing the site completely, removing the last of the debris and leveling the ground. Then came the foundation. Pouring concrete is both art and science. The mix has to be right. The weather has to cooperate. The foundation must be level and strong because everything else sits on it. As Earl watched the concrete spread and set, he felt a sense of stability returning. It was as if the farm itself were healing, setting down new roots to replace the ones ripped up by the storm. When the framework went up, the scene was reminiscent of the day the original barn had been raised. This time, however, there were cranes and power tools alongside hammers and hands. The men and women lifting beams and nailing boards were both older and younger than those who had done it 50 years earlier. Earl's sons were among them, lending muscle and laughter. Teens from the community came after school and on weekends. Local contractors donated time and expertise. The work was a combination of community effort and professional craftsmanship, each complementing the other. Throughout the building process, Earl felt a deep connection to his father. He could almost see him standing with a level in his hand, checking that the beams were straight. He could hear him reminding everyone to take breaks and drink water. He could feel his pride when the roof trusses were set in place. This connection was both comforting and motivating. It reminded Earl that he was part of a lineage, that he was continuing a tradition that his father had started and that his children might one day carry on. The new barn began to take shape. The walls went up, solid and plumb. The roof beams were set, this time with stronger fasteners and hurricane straps designed to resist uplift. The siding was attached, each board straight and true. Windows were installed to allow natural light in during the day and ventilation to keep the interior cool. The doors were hung on sturdy hinges. The stalls were built with smooth boards and strong latches. Earl walked through it daily as it grew, running his hand along the new wood, imagining animals inside, hearing the echoes of footsteps that would soon fill the space. During the construction, there were moments of frustration. Materials arrived late. Weather delayed pours. A piece of equipment broke down at a critical moment. These setbacks were small compared to the loss of the barn itself, but they were reminders that rebuilding is never a straight path. Earl handled them with the patience that comes from years of farming. He had learned long ago that yelling at the sky does not stop the rain. He focused on what he could control and let the rest unfold as it would. As the new barn neared completion, Earl felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Excitement because the structure was beautiful. It stood tall and strong. It had clean lines and smelled of fresh pine and paint. It promised protection and utility. Apprehension because he knew that no building is immune to nature. He also knew that the new barn could never replace the old one emotionally. It would create new memories, but it would not resurrect the old ones. The barn that had been lost would always hold a unique place in his heart. The day the new barn was finished, the community gathered again. This time, there were no hammers, just smiles and relief. They walked through the stalls and patted the walls. They admired the bright red paint and the gleaming metal roof. They laughed at the modern conveniences like automatic waterers. They ate at picnic tables set up outside and toasted to new beginnings. Earl stood in the center of the barn, taking it all in. He felt his father's presence as strongly as he had during the raising of the old barn. He felt Sarah's smile. He felt his children's arms around him. He felt the community's support like a physical force. He realized that this barn, though new, carried all of those connections within its walls. If you have ever rebuilt after a loss, you know the strange combination of joy and sorrow that comes with completion. You are proud of what you have accomplished. You are grateful for the support you received. You are relieved that the work is done. Yet there is an undertow of sadness because the need to rebuild means something precious was lost. Earl felt that undertow, but he did not let it drag him down. He let it remind him of the barn that had been and of the continuous thread that connected the old to the new. He knew that the story did not end with the storm. It continued with the hands that lifted the beams and hammered the nails. It continued with the animals that would soon find shelter inside. It continued with the seasons that would come and go, each adding new layers to the narrative. With the new barn standing, Earl returned to the rhythms of farm life. There were fields to plant, animals to feed, fences to fix. Life on a farm is cyclical, tied to the seasons. It does not pause for long, even after a disaster. The storm had been a disruption, a tear in the fabric of the year, but the fabric was mending. Earl found himself waking with the sun again, his steps directed by the same tasks that had filled his days for decades. He took comfort in these routines. They were familiar, grounding. They reminded him that the farm was not defined by a single building, but by the work and love poured into every acre. The new barn quickly became part of that routine. Earl learned the feel of its doors, the sound of its hinges, the way light filtered through its windows at different times of day. He introduced the animals to their new stalls. They sniffed the fresh wood, pawed at the straw, and settled in. The horses seemed to enjoy the wider space. The cats found new hiding spots. The loft filled with hay, neatly stacked, the smell of it mixing with the scent of lumber. It began to feel like home, not in replacement of the old barn, but in addition to the memories it represented. In time, the new barn would accumulate its own layers of history. A scratch on a door where a horse got excited, a nail hammered in quickly on a cold morning, a dusty corner where a child might sneak away with a book. The months following the storm were busy and healing. Earl's children visited more often. They brought their own children who climbed on the tractors and fed the chickens with the same wide-eyed wonder Earl remembered seeing in his own sons and daughter. He taught them how to hold their hands flat when feeding a horse so they would not get bitten. He showed them how to plant seeds in straight rows. He told them stories about their grandmother and great-grandfather. These moments were gifts. They were evidence that life moves forward, that new generations pick up the threads of old stories and weave them into their own. Earl also spent time reflecting on the storm and what it had taught him. He realized that while you cannot control when a storm arrives, you can control how you prepare and how you respond. He had prepared as best he could. Given his knowledge at the time, he had responded with courage in the moment, choosing to save the animals and get out when the danger became too great. He had accepted help when it was offered and had not let pride keep him from leaning on his community. He had chosen to rebuild rather than let the loss define the rest of his life. These were small choices, maybe, but collectively they shaped the outcome. He thought about how often life is like that. We do not control the big events that come our way, the storms, the illnesses, the sudden losses, but we do control our small, everyday choices. We choose whether to show up. We choose whether to stay bitter or become better. We choose whether to rebuild or walk away. These choices reflect our values. They reveal our character. In Earl's case, his choices reflected the values his parents had instilled in him: faith, family, perseverance, and the dignity of honest labor. He hoped that by living those values, he had passed them on to his children and grandchildren. He hoped that they would face their storms with the same resilience. The storm had also taught him about letting go. Letting go of a physical structure is difficult when that structure is tied to so many memories. But letting go does not mean forgetting. It means acknowledging the loss, grieving it, and then opening yourself up to what comes next. It means allowing yourself to build something new without constantly comparing it to what was lost. It means recognizing that life is dynamic, that change is inevitable, and that resilience lies in adaptability. Letting go is an act of courage because it requires trust. Trust in yourself, in your community, and in whatever higher power you believe guides the unfolding of events. If you have ever had to let go of something or someone you cherished, you know how hard it is. You know how your hands want to clench around what is slipping away, how your mind plays loops of memories, how your heart aches. You also know that holding on too tightly to what is gone can keep you from receiving what is coming. Earl's journey through the storm and the rebuilding of the barn was in many ways a lesson in healthy letting go. It was not about erasing the past. It was about honoring it and then taking a step forward without it. As summer turned to autumn, Earl watched the leaves turn gold and red. The new barn looked beautiful, framed by the colors of fall. The evenings were cooler. Harvest time approached. Once again, Earl found himself in the fields with machinery humming, dust swirling, and the low sun casting long shadows. He felt the familiar ache in his back and the satisfaction of full-grain bins. He felt the rhythm of life on the farm settle back into place. The storm was a chapter, not the whole story. The barn was a page, not the book. The book was still being written. In the quiet moments, Earl would sometimes walk out to where the old barn had stood. The ground was now grass, but he could still see the outline in his mind. He would stand there and close his eyes and see the red walls, the white trim, the horse stalls, the loft. He would hear his father's laugh, his mother's voice calling, his children's footsteps. He would feel the worn wood under his palm, and then he would open his eyes and look at the new barn and feel gratitude. Gratitude for what had been, for what he had, and for what would be. Gratitude for the storm, strange as that might sound, because it had revealed the strength of his community and his own resilience. Gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild and continue. The story of Earl Mitchell and his barn is not just about a building and a storm. It is about something larger, the unbreakable spirit of those who work the land and the values that sustain them through adversity. The Last Farmer channel exists to honor stories like Earl's. It exists to remind us that behind every field of corn or beans, behind every herd of cattle, behind every red barn on a country road, there is a person who has made choices like Earl's. Choices to wake up early. Choices to stay when it would be easier to leave. Choices to plant seeds without guarantees. Choices to rebuild after storms. If you are watching this story from a high-rise apartment or a suburban home, you might wonder what this story has to do with you. Perhaps you have never set foot on a farm. Perhaps your only connection to agriculture is through the food on your table. Here is what Earl's story offers you, a mirror for your own challenges. We all face storms. Some are literal, like tornadoes or hurricanes. Others are metaphorical, a layoff, an illness, a relationship ending. Earl's storm took his barn, but not his will to continue. Your storm might take something precious from you. It might shake you to your core. But like Earl, you have the power to choose how you respond. You can choose to stand in the face of the wind. You can choose to pick up the pieces. You can choose to rebuild. There is also a lesson here about community. Earl did not rebuild alone. His neighbors came with gloves and casseroles. They lifted the heavy beams and the heavy burden. They reminded him that he was not isolated, even though his farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel road. In our own lives, it can be tempting to isolate ourselves when the storm hits. We pull back. We hide our pain. We tell ourselves that nobody can understand. But we are communal creatures. We need each other. We need someone to put a hand on our shoulder and say that they are there. We need someone to help us sort the debris. We need someone to remind us that rebuilding is possible. If you have ever been on the receiving end of that kind of support, you know its power. If you have ever been the one offering it, you know the fulfillment that comes from showing up. In our modern world, where so much of our interaction happens through screens, it is easy to forget the tangible impact of physical presence. Earl's story is a call to action to be that presence in someone's life. It is a reminder that casseroles and work gloves can be powerful acts of love. The story is also about the passage of values across generations. Earl learned resilience, integrity, and hard work from his parents. He lived those values and passed them to his children. They, in turn, are teaching them to their children. This chain is not automatic. It requires intentionality. It requires living in a way that allows your values to be visible. It requires telling stories like Earl telling his grandchildren about their great-grandfather. If you have children or young people in your life, consider what stories you are telling them. Consider what values you are demonstrating through your actions. Earl's children saw him stand in the face of a tornado, release the animals, and then rebuild. They saw his determination. They saw his humility in accepting help. They saw his respect for what was lost and his hope for what could be built. Those images will stay with them long after the last board of the new barn fades. For those who have lost something irreplaceable, this story offers a companion. It does not pretend that rebuilding is easy or that loss does not matter. It acknowledges the pain. It sits with it. It allows you to cry and to laugh and to feel everything in between. It then offers a hand and says that together you can see what can be built. It does not rush the process. It does not minimize the grief. It simply holds space for both grief and growth, understanding that they can coexist. There is also a quiet spirituality in this story. Earl's faith was not showy. It was lived out in the way he treated his animals, his land, and his neighbors. It was present in his decision to stand in the barn when the storm approached, not out of recklessness, but out of reverence for what his father had built. It was evident in the prayer he whispered as the funnel cloud touched down. It was sustained in his gratitude for being spared when the barn was not. His faith did not protect him from the storm, but it anchored him through it. If you have a faith, spiritual practice, or guiding philosophy, consider how it anchors you. Does it give you the strength to stand in the storm? Does it remind you to be thankful even when things fall apart? As viewers of The Last Farmer, you are part of this narrative. By listening to Earl's story, you keep alive the values he represents. You help ensure that the experiences of farmers do not fade into silence. You affirm that hard work, tradition, and resilience matter. You remind yourselves and others that there is dignity in honest labor. You also take those lessons into your own life, whether you are farming, raising a family, building a business, or facing a storm of your own. You apply Earl's courage to your context. You become part of the story of resilience, adding your chapter to the long tale of people who refuse to let the winds define them. If this story resonates with you, if you find yourself thinking about your own barns, literal or metaphorical, that have been taken by storms, share your experience. Share the moment you thought you would break and the choice you made to rebuild. Share how your community showed up or how you wish they had. Share the values that anchored you. By doing so, you contribute to a tapestry of resilience that spans geography and vocation. You remind someone else that they are not alone, just as Earl's neighbors reminded him. You become part of the support system that turns storms into stories of survival. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the sharpest memories. Years after the storm, Earl could still recall the sound of the barn collapsing, but it no longer echoed with the same intensity. It had become part of the fabric of his life story, woven in with other experiences. The new barn, once bright and unfamiliar, aged into its surroundings. Its paint faded slightly under the sun, giving it a lived-in look. It creaked in the wind like any old barn. It collected its own scratches and dents. It was not the same as the barn his father built, but it did not need to be. It was a continuation, not a replacement. Earl's grandchildren grew up with the new barn as their backdrop. They heard the story of the storm and the barn that was lost. They saw the bent horseshoe hanging above the door, a relic from the old barn. They heard how their grandfather had stood in the hayloft and watched the funnel cloud form. They listened to how the community came together to rebuild. These stories became part of their own identity. When they faced challenges, a hard exam, a lost job, a broken relationship, they thought of their grandfather standing against the wind. They thought of their family rebuilding. They thought of the values passed down to them. Stand firm, ask for help, rebuild.
Looks strong.
As Earl aged, his relationship with the farm evolved. He slowed down physically.
Perfect.
But his connection to the land
Best
deepened.
fence in the valley.
He spent more time reflecting, watching sunrises from the porch,
Just the way I
and
like
walking the fields without the urgency of tasks. He took pride in what he had built and what he had endured. He knew that he would not farm forever. He began teaching his children more about the intricacies of the land, not just how to operate machinery, but how to read the soil, how to listen to the wind, how to care for animals. These lessons were not just technical, they were philosophical. They were about how to live, not just how to farm. Years turned into decades. Earl grew old, his hair white, his hands arthritic. His children took over more of the daily responsibilities on the farm. He still walked out to the barn every day, though sometimes with a cane. He still patted the door as he passed and whispered a thanks. He still stood in the space where the old barn had stood and closed his eyes, seeing red walls and hearing past laughter. He still smiled at the new barn, proud of its lines, grateful for its shelter. He still remembered the storm, but it no longer filled him with sorrow. It filled him with gratitude for the strength he discovered and for the community that surrounded him. On the anniversary of the storm each year, Earl and his family gathered in the barn for a meal. They set up tables and chairs. They cooked food and shared stories. They invited neighbors. They remembered the barn that was lost, the people who helped, and the values that carried them through. It became a tradition, a celebration not of loss, but of resilience. They called it Barn Day. They would say that phrase and laugh. It might sound odd to celebrate a day when something precious was destroyed, but for Earl's family, it was a reminder that even destruction can lead to renewal. It was a time to express gratitude and to reaffirm their commitment to each other and to the land. If you have not created a ritual around a difficult moment in your life, consider doing so. Rituals give shape to experiences that are otherwise chaotic. They allow you to mark the passage of time and to assign meaning to events that might otherwise feel senseless. Earl's Barn Day did not erase the pain of losing the barn, but it transformed that pain into a source of connection and strength. It turned the anniversary of destruction into a celebration of survival. It reinforced the lesson that storms can be catalysts for growth. As the Last Farmer channel continues to share stories like Earl's, it invites viewers into a space where courage is celebrated, where quiet strength is honored, and where the values of hard work and tradition are kept alive. Earl Mitchell's story is one among many, but it captures something essential about the spirit of rural America and about the human condition in general. It teaches us that even when the storm takes the barn, it cannot take the man. It cannot take his integrity, his community, or his will to rebuild. In your own life, you will face storms. Some will come with warnings. Others will appear without prelude. You might see the clouds building, or you might be knocked off your feet without knowing what hit you. You might have time to prepare, moving equipment and checking doors, or you might not. In those moments, remember Earl. Remember his decision to stand, his decision to act, his decision to accept help, and his decision to rebuild. Remember that losing something you love is not the end of your story. It is a hard page, but the chapter continues. The Last Farmer is dedicated to telling these stories not to romanticize struggle, but to honor it. In a world that often prizes convenience and quick fixes, farming stands as a counterpoint. It is long-term, it is messy, it is uncertain. It requires faith in things you cannot control. It requires dedication to processes that unfold over seasons and years. It requires resilience in the face of weather, markets, pests, and fatigue. Earl's story shows that farmers are not just working a job. They are living a vocation. They are stewards of the land, keepers of tradition, and examples of perseverance. If you are inspired by Earl's story, there are ways to carry that inspiration into action. Support local farmers by buying directly from them when you can. Learn about where your food comes from. Visit a farm if the opportunity arises and see firsthand the work involved. if you live far from the fields. Support organizations that advocate for farmers and rural communities. And perhaps most importantly, apply the lessons of resilience, community, and values to your own context. You do not need to live on a farm to embody the spirit of a farmer. You can approach your work with the same integrity. You can care for your family with the same dedication. You can face your storms with the same courage. As we conclude this story, consider taking a moment to reflect. What barn represents your history? What storm has threatened it? How did you respond? Who showed up for you? How did you rebuild? If you have not yet faced your storm, who will you call when it arrives? What values will anchor you? Reflecting on these questions can prepare you, strengthen you, and connect you to a lineage of resilience that spans time and place. The storm took the barn, but not the man. It tested Earl's faith and his strength, but it did not break him. It tore down wood and nails, but it could not tear down the values that defined him. It brought rain and wind, but it also brought neighbors and casseroles. It left a path of destruction, but it also left a foundation for rebuilding. It was a force of nature, but it met a force of spirit that refused to yield. That is the heart of this story. That is why it matters. That is why we tell it. If you have found courage in these words, if you have felt your own resilience stir, share this story with someone who might need it. Let them know that barns fall and storms rage, but people rebuild and spirits endure. Let them know that they are not alone in their struggles and that their story, like Earl's, can inspire others. Let them know that the last farmer community is a place where stories of strength are honored and where the values that built this country are still alive. If you want to join us in honoring farmers and their stories, subscribe to The Last Farmer to support these stories and values. This story ends where it began, with a storm on the horizon and a man standing at the door of his barn. But this time, the man is not alone. He is surrounded by his children, his grandchildren, and his community. The barn is not just a building, it is a symbol of resilience and continuity. The storm, whether literal or metaphorical, is not just a force of destruction, it is a catalyst for growth and connection. The man stands with hands weathered by work, a heart full of memories, and eyes that have seen both loss and renewal. He knows that storms will come. He also knows that he will not face them alone. In the end, the barn and the storm reveal a truth about life. Nothing is permanent except the values you live by and the relationships you cultivate. Buildings fall, crops fail, plans change. But integrity, love, and perseverance endure. Earl Mitchell's story is a testament to that truth. It is a story for anyone who has stood in the face of a storm and decided to stay, anyone who has sifted through debris and found hope, anyone who has rebuilt when rebuilding seemed impossible. It is a story for the last farmers and for anyone who has ever felt like one, planting seeds in uncertain soil, working hard for uncertain results, trusting that the harvest will come if you keep the faith and keep your hands busy. As you turn off this story and return to your own life, carry this story with you. Let it remind you that you are part of a community of people who endure. Let it remind you to be the neighbor with the casserole. Let it remind you to be the one who stands in the barn door when the winds pick up. Let it remind you to build something that matters, and if it falls, to build again. Let it remind you that the storm can take the barn, but it cannot take the man if the man chooses to remain unbroken. Thank you for listening to this story and for caring about the people who work the land. May your own storms reveal your strength, and may you always find the courage to rebuild with hope and grace.